I'm joined in the studio now by Plus Financial Group's Senior Protection Expert, Matthew Chapman, and Nick Telfer, Head of Protection Specialist at Vitality, to assess where the value truly lies when it comes to well-being with value-added services. So Nick, Matt, thank you for joining us this morning for this conversation. And I think it's fair to say that value-added services divide opinion in protection and health insurance. So we're going to look this morning a little bit about where the value truly lies. But to start our conversation off this morning, we're going to push out an audience poll. So we encourage you all to share your opinions on this, and we'll come back in about 20 minutes or so to have a look at the results. But on the Swapcard platform, on the polls tab, you'll be able to see a question: how do you rate the value in wellbeing value-added services? So please do make your opinions known on that for us to take a look at a little bit later on. Now, to start us off, Matt, I'm going to turn to you. Value-added services have become such a core, almost, part of the protection proposition. My question to you is, how did we get here? I mean, what are the key drivers that have brought us to this point in the relation between the actual insurance proposition itself and these services?
That's a brilliant question. I mean, Nick and I were actually talking about this before we came in, and it was interesting because we were talking about sort of like the organic structure of where they came from and how sort of rural London was pushing that, what became the helping hand products many, many years ago. And then obviously Vitality's been developing its shared value proposition for some time. I think a lot of it comes down to this idea of trying to offer something to the consumer that adds immediate value at the point of sale. Because the problem with most insurance or protection policies, if you think about it, is most people are going to hope, let's be honest, let's hope that they never actually have to make a claim or never have to have the policy pay out. So how do you then justify something on a regular basis that you're paying for month in, month out to make the client feel they're actually gaining some kind of value for money, when in theory, the hope is that it never actually ends up paying out? And I think the way that's been developed over time is that providers have been looking to introduce value-added services, value-added benefits that provide some tangible value in an immediate sense for something that people are paying for on a regular basis, to continue that justification of having that policy in place. And hopefully things that are going to also add intrinsic value. And I think in many respects, that's the question that we need to be thinking about, is where are we going and how is it going to develop in the future? Because there's been kind of this almost like, I would call it an arms race essentially, where people are going out there and introducing these value-added benefits. And essentially, I think at times it can appear almost if they're doing it for marketing purposes or just to add, like I say, that intrinsic value at point of sale. But are they delivering true, real value for the consumer? And if so, how? And how do we police that and manage that moving forward?
That's interesting. And Nick, from a provider perspective, how much do you think these services are coming to define the protection proposition?
Interesting question. I think what Matt said there is spot on around the fact that if you're selling protection, it's a really hard sell, selling protection, because you're actually trying to get someone to buy something they never want to have to use. And that makes it very, very tricky. Now, by adding some value to that, and certainly from the Vitality perspective, our whole proposition is pivoted on this shared value model, which is about creating a virtuous circle. So it returns value for the consumer. It helps the us as an insurer, but also I think something else we need to think about is the value to society of what we do, and that's another part of the shared value model. Because I think often, I don't know, maybe the audience will correct me here, but sometimes we're a little bit embarrassed about what we do. I think we can be very, very proud as an industry of what we do, how we help society, because ultimately what we're here to do is put people in a position where they're no longer reliant on the welfare system. The welfare system's there as that catch-all for people. But from an insurer's perspective, going back to your question, it's a way of differentiating your proposition. We've been in an era of prices being driven down and down and down. The market's become very, very commoditized. That hasn't really helped the consumer. It's stifled innovation. And I think if we can come out of that, the way to do that is by creating a proposition that's much more engaging for the consumer and benefits us as an insurer and a society, and of course the advisor. Because advice is pivotal to protection. And anything beyond a pure price-driven proposition needs that advice, and that's the way that Matt as an advisor can differentiate himself from an online service that a customer can go and do it themselves.
And your use of the word differentiator is quite as interesting. I'm going to turn to you, Matt. Do you think this is from your position as an advisor, when you're looking across the provider landscape, do you think this is where differentiation has been focused for quite some time now in these value-added services ecosystem rather than the policies themselves, the core product? Is this where we're differentiating now and this is the direction of travel?
I think to an extent, yeah, it has to be. I mean, if you think about it from a very sort of contractual point of view, there can't be that much difference contractually between a full-term income protection policy that's on an own occupation basis or even essentially a life insurance contract, because they pretty much do what they say on the tin. There can't be that much differentiators between the two. I mean, if we talk about critical illness or serious illness or something like that, yes, okay, you can drive differentials between, the product definitions or the illness definitions or the way in which you pay out or the structure of those plans. But as I say, where you've got those kind of core protection solutions, how do you differentiate one product from another? So providers have then been looking at, well, how do we add this intrinsic value? How do we differentiate ourselves from the competition? How do we partner with service providers who can deliver intrinsic value to our customers and add something extra into the policy so that people then take note and look at our policies, and then it becomes less of a price-driven concept and more, where do we add the value? I think that's a really good concept and it's a fantastic question. My only concern is that if we go so far down that route, and then as an advisor, I'm then making recommendations, not purely, but partially to do with the value-added benefits or services that were included in the policy, there is an inherent risk if I'm making compliance recommendations that I rely on those too heavily when they may not be contractual benefits. And that's a real concern that I've got as an advisor, because when I write my demands and needs letters or my suitability letters and I'm justifying why I've chosen one provider over another, I have to be very careful that I'm not driving a poor outcome on the basis that at some point those benefits or services could be withdrawn by the provider because they're not contractually bound to do so.
Now, there's some interesting points. And I think if we look at the element of well-being when it comes to value-added services, now well-being, as we've already heard today, is such a subjective term and it means so many different things to so many different people. How do we even start looking at defining and measuring value when it comes to well-being focused services? I'll let whoever wants to take that one on.
No, I'll kick off on that. I think as a collective noun, value-added services, added value services, I don't think that works because I don't think it actually describes what the insurer's trying to do. And certainly from our perspective at Vitality, it's very much about prevention. But I think it's quite clear that the types of services that are available through insurance policies, life insurance policies, they're either reactive or proactive. And it comes back to the point Matt made earlier about the fact that something bad's got to happen for you to get any benefit or value back from an insurance policy in its purest term. It's a way of bringing that value forward. I think one of the things as well that we can, where they really do bring value is certainly with our programme, it's encouraging engagement. It's often been said that people take out a life insurance policy, stick it in the drawer, and we as an industry have been guilty for many years of not reminding people why they've got the cover. There's been a lot of talk about it, but we're still not there as an industry. But it's creating those touch points, and it's touch points for us as an insurer, it's touch points for Matt to be able to go to that customer and remind them of the value of that proposition. Now that can be articulated through peace of mind, of course. That was the fundamental value of protection, but that's quite intangible. And when we're in a situation now where prices are going up left, right, and centre, people are going to start looking at the bottom line on their bank statement. What is that? What is that X pounds a month I'm paying to company B? If they don't realise, then they're going to lapse it. And if you as an advisor haven't got that relationship and that continuing relationship, not just selling something and walking away, then you're vulnerable.
I agree. And in terms of adding value, okay, my concern is that some of the things that we've seen come to the fore in the market recently may even be topical or seasonal. relative to what's going on in the marketplace, which is no bad thing in many respects, because like I say, it adds that, like you've said, Nick, that intrinsic value that people can utilise and justify the plan and the expense that they're paying every month. But, we've seen like this sort of rise in things like GP services, online GP services and 24/7 GP services because of a lack of availability to go and see your local GP and the pandemic and the issues that that's caused. And I celebrate that because that adds real intrinsic value to people. However, there is a concern that, if we keep looking at these things and sort of adding these bolt-on services, is there a point where they stop becoming economically viable or even value in the sense of they add something to the plan, or either something like Nick's pointed out, either something preventative or at the point of claim is going to really provide true value to the consumer or the claimant, and it just becomes something that's done more from a marketing perspective just to try and force that differentiation. And I'm concerned that maybe if we go too much down that route, we stop offering real value and just stop offering sales ploys or marketing tools to help advisors recommend that product over another. That's my concern.
Yeah. So, I think, there was just something I wanted to add there, and I think this isn't a criticism of anyone, it's just the way the market's gone. That I think we've become very obsessed with comparing product A with product B, and I think we've got to sort of almost have a clean slate and start thinking about going back to the customer and thinking about what's the most appropriate solution for that customer.
And outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely, because ultimately that's what we live or die by. It is something, again, it's that whole engagement piece and delivering, and value is easy to measure. We can measure value in terms of how much money we return to customers in terms of savings by using the Vitality program. We hit the number of health assessments. I guess when we're talking about protection, we're judged at the moment by the claims we pay. But I hope in time we'll get to a situation where we're judged by the claims we prevent.
Or how many people you've rehabilitated.
Absolutely, when it comes to income protection.
Absolutely.
People don't want to be ill.
No.
And sometimes we take a slightly negative view of people. A lot of people want to be working. They want to be healthy.
So Matt, I'm going to come back to something you were saying now, and I'll get your thoughts on this, Nick, as well. What you're talking there about longevity and suitability of wellbeing services.
Yeah.
What you're talking about sustainability here, really, aren't you? That's what we're talking about here in terms of the shelf life, essentially, of these services. And you could perhaps, from a cynical point of view, say, well, when COVID is a thing of the past, how relevant will these services still be? Will the industry have moved on to something else? And Nick, I'm interested in your thoughts around the sustainability of wellbeing services like this.
The challenge we've got, I guess, is, and this is probably a challenge for the protection industry, the fundamental challenge, which is optimism bias. People don't think it's going to happen to them. People think they're healthier than they actually are. These two things go very closely together. If you look at the Public Health England, beginning of last year, did some research in the light of COVID, and it demonstrated the changing attitudes of consumers. 70-80% of people looking to improve their lifestyle. Now that's 78-80% of the population of England. That's 78% of any advisor customers, that's your customers. They want to be having these conversations. They want to be healthier, and if we can do that, it's got to be a better outcome than sitting there for 10 years paying a premium, something going wrong. Luckily, they haven't lapsed it, but and then they get a payout. It's got to be better to prevent. So I think this is the way the industry has to go. I think there's an old, I think it was Einstein said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting to get a different result. And it's the same with protection insurance. We need to try these things. There's some really good benefits out there. We've got Vitality, there's other support benefits, things like virtual GP services. These are things that COVID has allowed us to bring into the proposition because it's become much more relevant to the consumer.
Yeah, I think in terms of longevity, I think these are really good points, Nick. And your question goes back to sustainability, John. I think my concern here is that, and taking a very cynical approach and being quite controversial when I say this, that in theory, when you add these value-added benefits or value-added services into a policy, there is an inherent cost for the provider. Okay, naturally, to offer these services, it's going to cost somebody along the line. And if it's not going to be included in the premiums on the policy, as in it's a non-contractual benefit, somebody's paying. And at the minute, that'll be a relationship between the service provider and the insurance provider. And my concern there is that in this sort of bid or desire to offer them all of these benefits, there is probably a cynical perspective here to say that actually the provider probably doesn't want too many people to take advantage of those services because there's going to be an additional cost, which then would then either have to affect the bottom line or be passed on to the consumer or the advisor in terms of cost. So there is an approach that I'm thinking here, which is actually if you continue to do these things and you keep looking at them, then unless we inherently change and move more to, I suppose, almost like this shared value model that we're seeing from some of the providers these days, then there is a risk that actually you're pushing products out there that don't really have any value, that are not economically viable and wouldn't be sustainable, because the more people that use them or the more benefit they give, actually, the less financially viable they become in many respects. So I'd prefer, from my perspective as an advisor and dealing with clients that go through the claims process, I'd much rather see, as Nick says, far more things built in to help with preventative measures. So how do we stop people from falling in the first place? How do we stop people from needing to submit a claim? Because I'm sure we'd all agree we'd much rather be in that position than actually have to end up making a claim and get paid. I would much rather be fit and healthy and not diagnosed with an illness than receive the benefit payment from an insurance contract. But also, secondary to that, when a person goes through the claims process, I'd much rather see a lot of the investment be directed towards services and ancillary support, that when someone's going through a claims process, we can do a lot more for them. And you look at the one that the Chrysalis product that came out on behalf of Guardian, so the relationship we've got there, that kind of thing that you see in the market where you're seeing more direct solutions that deliver value to people that go through that particular situation. And that, for me, is where I would prefer to see more of the direction heading, that the value we add is really more linked to the product, the concept of the product we're talking about anyway as an advisor, and that actually isn't just there for fluffy or marketing purposes, that delivers real tangible value to the consumer.
Yeah,
fair enough.
And I think the sustainability point is a valid one. From our perspective at Vitality, we're owned by Discovery, a South African company, just celebrated its 30th anniversary. The whole business, which is now has a global reach, is pivoted on the shared value model. So it is sustainable.
And clearly it works,
but
right?
You've got to get it right. Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of experimentation that will go on as other companies look at this, and we're seeing more companies looking at the preventative side of things. But it's a try and learn thing. And
of course.
Ultimately, if it saves one person getting cancer, one person not having a heart attack or a stroke, then that's your value.
It's a good outcome.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, we are coming towards the end of our session this morning. So just quickly, we'll look at the poll results about people's opinions about value-added services. So about 2/3 of people rated it as good in terms of the value. I mean, do you think that's about right? I mean, no one said it was poor. The rest were average or excellent, but around 2/3, a general consensus that these services provide good value. I mean, is that what you'd expect to see?
Yeah, about that, I would say, yeah.
Yeah, I think. I mean, it's as we said earlier, it's about. I mean, from that, it's giving the opportunity to have a different conversation with the customer. So it's whether you want to change your business model a little bit and change the way you have your conversations.
Okay, guys, we have probably time for one question from the audience. Now, we've got about a dozen here, so I will try. Clearly, it's a subject of interest for our audience, which is great. But what I'll try and summarise a few into one question, if possible. And I think that would be, what's your opinion about whether the protection industry, when it comes to services, when it comes to the wellbeing value, is becoming too transactional?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, potentially. And as I said, it goes back to this economically viable business model. And I think that's probably why, and I don't want to sit here and talk about individual providers too much, but I think that's probably why you see more intrinsic value in the Vitality proposition, because you've got something that's sharing the value amongst all. And yes, it might be considered transactional, because of course, clients are taking out policies and paying premiums, but they're seeing something tangible in return, and it's benefiting their health and well-being whilst benefiting that of the provider. Now, I'm concerned that if we go down this route of, yes, it's all very much, look, that's the cost, and isn't it a great benefit, that actually we detract from the real value of the policy, and it stops being about the policy itself and the benefit the policy provides, and it becomes more about, well, isn't this a nice little bolt-on to have? And I want to move away from that kind of bolt-on philosophy and more into one of intrinsic value.
All right, Matt, Nick, I think we've probably pretty much come to the end of our session, and we could probably spend about another hour going through all these questions we've got from people. But thanks very much for coming in and joining us this morning and sharing your insights on what is clearly, like I said at the start, a bit of a divisive, a bit of a touchy subject for many people in the industry. But thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, that's great.